Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. I'm president and CEO of Fund the People, where our mission is to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. We give funders and nonprofits cutting-edge ideas, research, and tools to help drive equity, effectiveness, and endurance in the social sector. So let's start the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. Today, we have a fantastic guest who has been helping the nonprofit sector to measure its progress and helping donors to find good nonprofits to donate to. So I'm pleased to be joined by Michael Thatcher, President and CEO of Charity Navigator. Hello, Michael. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here, Rusty. Thank you.
I really appreciate you making the time to do this and also the willingness to answer all the questions that I want to throw your way.
Always love the dialogue, and I think the only way we get better is by answering the hard questions and sometimes not being able to answer them and then realizing I've got to go back and work on something. So I appreciate the challenge.
Well, I'm hoping, as I was telling you earlier, as an interviewer, a novice interviewer, I am working on getting tougher. So before we get more into it, I would love it if you just told our listeners briefly what Charity Navigator is and what it does and how nonprofits and grant makers and individual donors can use Charity Navigator.
Sure. So Charity Navigator is the nation's largest independent evaluator of nonprofits. We have ratings on almost 250,000 nonprofits. We do this for free. We don't charge the charities. We don't charge the donor. We do the assessment. We also create curated lists that help sort of focus the donor in on either a crisis that's ongoing, best of certain cause areas. We've started something new in the last 2 years, which we're calling Causeway, which are, think of a mutual fund where you could give to an issue fund of, let's say, education or veterans issues. So that's basically what we offer. We also have an alert system. So when something inappropriate happens or accusations of inappropriate behavior, so we're essentially there as a donor resource. We have roughly about 10 million site visits a year to the website. So everything happens on the website, so charitynavigator.org. And as a nonprofit, I would say the thing that you want to do with Charity Navigator is you want to claim your profile with Charity Navigator and you want to give us additional data, because if we don't have additional data from you, we're going to base a rating on just the IRS Form 990 and some website metrics from you. And that's a really limited snapshot. And I think that's the historical, let's say, your father's Charity Navigator was just looking at 990 data. Today's Charity Navigator gives you the option to articulate a lot more, but we can only do that if you give us data. And the way to do that is to claim your profile on the platform.
Cool. All right. So everyone should go check out charitynavigator.org. For those who are at 501c3s, make sure your profile is claimed if you're leading an organization. And what kind of stuff can folks add? Give us an example of one or two things that can enrich that profile.
Sure. So before you even get to giving us data, if you're a well-rated organization, if you're a 4-star charity or a 3-star charity, there's a branding kit that you can use to essentially flaunt your rating and let people know that you've got this third-party accreditation. And if you have a candid platinum profile, you're going to want to sort of use that. If you have a 4-star rating with Charity Navigator, you want to advertise that. Same thing if you've gone through the process of getting a BBB's Wise Giving accreditation. These are all ways of signaling to your donors that you've been evaluated by a third party and you've got good marks with them. And that you can get through logging into the nonprofit portal. There are 4 key areas that we're looking at for the ratings. There's accountability and finance, which is really just pulling data from the Form 990. It's looking at governance metrics. Do you have an independent board of directors? Are your finances in order? We also look at leadership and planning, or leadership and adaptability, we're calling it. That's really your place to state your mission, your goals, the strategy to achieve your mission. We're also looking, and this is an interesting metric, it's how much do you invest in your leadership? And so this, allows you to just articulate your story and let donors see that in a neutral fashion on the Charity Navigator site. Culture and community is a third area, or beacon that we call them. And that's looking at your internal feedback practices. So that's how do you listen to your constituents? One of the challenges that we have in the nonprofit sector is the person paying for the goods isn't the person receiving the goods.
Right.
So there's a broken value cycle. And so in the for-profit world, if you make a bad product, people stop buying it. The problem in the nonprofit sector is if you make a bad product or have a poor service, the person paying for it may never know that it's a poor service, and you may never know unless you actually engage in getting meaningful feedback from your constituents and the people that you're serving. And so we've been looking at that as it's a proxy metric to one, understand the impact you're making, but it also helps you improve program service delivery. And so we're looking at that. And then probably the most important is we do look at impact. We look at a cost per outcome assessment of your impact, and we're also looking at your internal measurement systems. So do you have internal mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation? And these can be quite simple because the reality is you have small starting out organizations, and then you have highly sophisticated nonprofits that are all in the Charity Navigator database. And so we're trying to make this accessible to a wide range of organizations so that we can directionally indicate this is a great charity that you should support.
I want to dig in this conversation to the issue of overhead and the overhead myth and how it plays out across the sector and at Charity Navigator. So again, let's start with the basics. To you, what does overhead mean and what gets counted as overhead? And why are certain things considered to be overhead and others not?
Overhead at a very basic level is any expense that is not related to your primary program. And so that includes finance, it includes HR, it might include your office. It's also any fundraising expense. And when we file a 990, which is the tax form that all nonprofits are filing,
right,
you split out how much goes to fundraising, how much goes to administrative costs, and then how much goes to program spend. And so historically, that transparency is a requirement of being a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States. And so it's built into our filing, and it's an available metric. There's history in that foundations and also the government for many years weren't paying any overhead fees. And so ultimately, Charity Navigator will be 25 in 2026. We really started by taking the best metrics that were out there and really institutionalizing them. And so I think we grabbed overhead 25 years ago and ran with it and said, this is a metric that everybody can get their minds around. It's actually a simple metric, and unfortunately, it became a proxy metric for impact. And I know I've spent the last 10 years of my life trying to undo that, or let's say trying to evolve it, because there's value in good finances, right? And you want robust finances as a nonprofit leader. There isn't value being judged on how you spend your money as a proxy for the impact you're making in the world. There's not a correlation there. From a financial management perspective, if 30% of your revenue is going to your program and 70% is going to administrative and fundraising expenses, something's funny, right? So I think it is a good metric for looking at anomalies within an organization, but telling you that this is an impactful organization, it doesn't tell you that. And it doesn't mean to tell you that, right? I think that's the other thing is it got misappropriated. And so we really need to look at outputs, outcomes, and impact of organizations. And unfortunately, that's a harder thing to measure. It's a lot harder to measure, right? And so it's not a simple back of the envelope, 70%, we're good.
Right. On an episode of another podcast called NGO Strategy and Soul, which I really like that show, you spoke extensively about what Charity Navigator is and does. And we'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. I think it's a really fantastic conversation you had with that host. And During a brief portion of the interview, you spoke about how Charity Navigator has altered its rating formula, how you judge or rate nonprofits, that it's become less numeric. There's been less numeric weight in that formula placed on the overhead percentage within nonprofit budgets. So if you could tell our listeners about that reform process, as you said, you've been working to de-emphasize overhead as a part of that process. Where would you say it started? Like when Charity Navigator started, was overhead the main thing that was being measured? And then how has it evolved and where are things now?
I'll try and give you sort of a brief history. When you think about Charity Navigator went live in 2002 with 1,100 ratings and looking at 7 financial metrics. That was it. Like there were 7 metrics and the bulk of that rating was overhead. In 2011, when the IRS Form 990 changed and there were additional governance and transparency metrics that were added to that form, we added an additional, I think, 17 metrics that were looking at whistleblower policy, independent board of directors, number of board members, things like that. And that was the first step towards getting away from just the financial assessment. That's when we went from sort of Charity Navigator 1.0 to Charity Navigator 2.0. In 2013 was the writing of the first overhead myth letter by Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and BBB's Wise Giving Alliance. And that was a letter that went out to the donor population saying, stop looking at overhead, start looking for impact. In 2014, there was a second letter that was sent, and this time it was sent to the nonprofits of the United States. And it was basically one of the challenges that after that first letter was written, there was this realization of, but there's no impact data. The nonprofits need to give us impact data. So the second letter was saying to nonprofits, you've got to share your impact data. At that time in 2014, Charity Navigator began working on a project that internally was called Results Reporting. It also had the name Charity Navigator 3.0. And this was my predecessor was really the champion for that. And that what it was looking at was an organization's internal capacity for measuring their own impact. That's actually in the rating today. But the way it rolled out, and they were rolling it out in 2014 and 2015, it didn't work at a scale level. And so it actually ended up slowing the organization down. In 2015, my predecessor departed the organization, and then later that same year, I joined the organization, and that project was essentially shelved at the time. And we began the journey of, all right, so how do we evolve the ratings some more? That went first through something we call Charity Navigator 2.1, which was an iteration which, again, softened the power of overhead. So one of the things up until 2015, if you had 99.9% program expense, that was the highest rating you could get. So it was an absolute metric. So in 2016, we dropped it from 99.9 to 85%. And then where we are now is it's no longer an absolute metric. It's a threshold metric, and it's 70%. But it's also, if you give us the additional data, and this is the really important part. You've got to give us additional data because it adds to the number of metrics and how we assess your organization. So that like a charity that has given all 4 beacons worth of data, overhead counts for 4% of your overall score. If you don't give us additional data, and we're only basing the rating on the 990, it can be between 13 to 25% of your score, depending on the size of the organization. That's a big variance, right? And the other data is not that hard for you to supply. It's something you're doing. It's part of your day-to-day business. So it's just a nice, clear way of actually articulating what you do to the donors.
So if you do give the additional data, say that again, your overhead ratio is what percent of your overall rating system?
It's about 4% of your 4%. Overall score. So we are still counting it, right? And I think it's fair to say, why is it still there if you don't think it's the right thing?
Right.
As I said before, it's a guideline, right? And it's also, donors are asking for it. And if they don't see it, they're going to go figure it out themselves. And so part of what we tried to do is sort of say, hey, donor, overhead's here, but you want to be looking at impact. So we're guiding folks to impact, but we're not removing it as we're in this process of transitioning folks from obsessing about overhead to actually obsessing about impact. And what's rewarding in this is that younger generations they're looking for impact. Mm-hmm. And I think the older generations are still kind of hooked on overhead right now. And so I think that's good for the future. It's still challenging for the moment. And I think we're working through that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the irony is that the more you can fundraise, the more you can build relationships, the more HR support you have for your staff, the more support the staff has. In other words, the more overhead you have, sometimes the more impact you can have. And so one of the things that I think it was Ken Berger, right?
Yep. Ken was my predecessor. Yep.
Yeah. So when I saw him give this speech, I think it was at an independent sector conference or something like that. He sort of tracked back, well, where does impact come from? It's about implementation, the programs and what's underneath that. There's capacity. But he didn't dig back much further. And I thought, well, wait, everyone wants to measure and see impact. But you trace it back to the source. It's the people doing the work. And yet the way our system is rigged up, the donors and foundations don't want to actually support the people who are doing the work. They don't want to pay salaries. They see salaries as overhead, even if those salaries are for people working on program. And so it undermines the impact, right? And that's, I think, why so many organizations don't have the impact that they want to have. And so many donors feel frustrated by that.
I think there's another challenge in this, which is it's more a taxonomy issue than it is overhead. And it's the word charity. And we have the charitable tax code. And there's this perception that doing charity is somehow something that shouldn't be paid for. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right.
And I think within the sector, we like to talk about nonprofit. The reality is even nonprofit's not a great way of defining ourselves. And I think Simon Sinek did a really nice talk on this where it's like, stop defining yourself in the negative. Mm-hmm. You're for-purpose organizations. I don't think that sticks right now, and the general public's definitely not using that. But when you define yourself in the negative, or when you define yourself as charity, and I think a lot of nonprofit leaders and professionals, it's not volunteer work. Right. These are seasoned professionals, many with PhDs.
Right.
And they deserve to be paid what it takes. In other words, you should get Dan Pallotta at some point on your podcast to talk about it, because he really has a great talk track on just, pay what it takes. But part of it, we've got to shift the mentality. These are people that are actually changing lives. They're saving lives. It deserves to be paid the right level. Salaries are not a bad thing. Salaries are essential. And one of the challenges that we run into in the nonprofit sector is if we don't pay enough, we can't retain our staff. And the turnover and the churn that comes from turnover, it disrupts our ability to be successful. And so ultimately, for the nonprofit sector to really thrive and do well, you need overhead. You need to be sustaining your organization, and you've got to pay your people right. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that really needs to be focused on. It's a little bit outside of scope for Charity Navigator, but it's something that where we're going to help out in that, because that's the hardest thing, is sort of retaining good people when they can make twice the money, if not 3 times the money, going into the for-profit space.
Yeah. I mean, this is why in October of 2025, Fund the People released the concept of a new kind of grant or a new kind of funding called staff operating support, where we said general operating support is nice, but it doesn't end up generally incentivizing or being used to invest in the team and help boost job quality, boost salary and benefits, boost organizational culture. It ends up just sort of being used maybe for program or maybe for other things, whatever is needed. And restricted funding often, again, disincentivizes or eliminates the ability to invest in those people systems and salaries and things. So we said we need a new kind of grant that actually is restricted for investing in people in the organization, but within that is flexible and responsive. So if you're going from 1 staff to 2 one year, that's a huge leap. You use your staff operating support grant for that. But then the next year you need to develop your board. Okay, let's use our staff operating support to invest in our volunteer staff, our volunteer leaders, the board, and so on. So that's what we've kind of pitched out to the fields, like we need a new kind of funding vehicle that actually incentivizes investments in our people rather than continuing to disincentivize it. So curious what you think of that concept and how that might be perceived by some of the donors who you talk to out there, or foundations or others.
You're making me think back to when I first started. So first of all, I think it's a great idea. And I think there's been a lot of pushback on program-specific funding and everything should be general operating. I think the beauty of program-specific funding is that it allows you to dedicate it to something that no one can mess with. Right. And one of the first grants I was able to get for Charity Navigator when I started, it was a grant to evolve the rating system. But the program officer at the time said, "You're doing something really big with Charity Navigator. How are you going to do the change management required to make that happen?" And I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I just need money to change the rating." And she said, "No. I'm giving you $75,000 for change management. You must use it for that." And I remember the board of directors at the time probably wouldn't have let me spend that much money on change management. And it was by far the most important grant I think we ever had at that really pivotal moment. New CEO coming in with all kinds of crazy ideas and a team that was used to doing things a certain way. I was desperate for that. And it was a lifeline to me. So I think program-specific funding, when dedicated to the right things, can be incredibly useful.
It sounds like the overhead formula, although it now carries much less weight than it did previously. And I love that it was an absolute metric and now it's a threshold metric. And so thank you for de-emphasizing it. And it sounds like the more nonprofits put into the system, put into their profile, the less donors are going to rely on that overhead, that 990 data to understand what they do and to judge them. And the less the system embedded in the website will rely on that overhead formula. So question is, today, would you commit publicly here on the show to removing the overhead formula 100% from the rating system by the end of next year? And why or why not?
The short answer is no, I can't commit to that. And I think part of it is something I mentioned earlier in that it's still something that's requested right away. Say, show me the overhead. I think what we're working on is showing people it's less interesting. And so as long as the demand is as high as it is right now, to remove it just creates a vacuum and creates more attention to it. The other thing is that I really do think part of what we're looking at is what's a healthy organization. And there's a big variance between what the financial makeup of different types of organizations is. So I was like the two extremes in overhead is museums that have incredibly high overheads just for the staff and maintaining of the security of the objects of art and things like that. And then food banks that have very low overhead, right? Because a lot of them are just pass-through facilities that are taking food and then redistributing it. And so overhead is still a meaningful measure. And it also, if your overheads are skewed too much the wrong way, something's not right in how you're actually delivering on the purpose that you're set up for. And I think donors should know that. And so I don't think it should count in the same way that I'll give you another metric that get asked for a lot, which we don't include it in the scoring, but we include it informationally, and that is CEO salary. Donors are obsessed with how much the CEO makes for some reason. It's not something we have ever used in the rating, but not including it on the profile is something that we've always done. And I think that might be the step where I won't commit to this right now on the show, but I will commit to investigating this. Could we get overhead to be in the same category as CEO salary, which is visually present, but not scored? That's something that's worth teasing out, because what it means at that point is that it's no longer relevant from a scoring perspective. And I think that's ultimately where we'd like to get to. But I think we're not ready to go there quite so quickly.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I've interviewed a couple of people now from BDO, the accounting firm, and they did this real change, real costs study with a dozen big foundations. And they said, let's understand what the indirect cost rates are and the overhead rates are in the sector really versus what we say they should be in our foundation guidelines. And so they studied, I think, 130,000 of 990s, and they looked at financial health and they judged that based on, do they have a decent reserve fund? I think it was 6 months. I can't remember. It was a number of months of budget in reserve. And so they actually said that's a positive thing. A lot of times these foundations say, if you don't spend all our money by the end of the grant term, you have to give it back, that kind of stuff. It's like the funders seem to want nonprofits to start from zero every year, as if that's somehow a financially healthy way to run a business or an organization, which doesn't make any sense. What business would want to start from zero every year in the bank? So they, for once, said, well, let's look at reserves as a positive thing. And they found that the overhead rates of the highest quadrant, the most financially healthy nonprofits of that data set, had an overhead rate of 29%, I think. And so some of those foundations had been funding at 5% or 10% overhead rate, saying you can use 10% of our grant or 15% for your overhead costs. And they changed it. Some of them went up to 29%. Some of them went from 10 to 20 as a baseline. And so to me, that was a very positive development. But I had the chance to interview the president of the MacArthur Foundation, who was one of those foundations involved in that initiative for this show. And he said he was surprised that more hadn't happened since then, that more foundations hadn't changed their overhead funding rates in their grants since then. So even when the big foundations are saying, well, if you want your grantees to be financially healthy, be realistic about the indirect cost rate, the overhead rate, and it's actually much bigger than most of us were saying it should be. So I'm curious if you followed that and what you think of that.
Yeah, we totally followed that. And MacArthur was really one of the leaders in that whole indirect cost study that took place.
Yeah.
We're very close to it. We've set the threshold at 70% program expense. And it's worth noting, when I say threshold, what I mean by that is you get to 70, you get all the points. You go to 71, you don't get more points. You go to 90, you don't get more points. And we did this also based on, we have a lot of data, right, based on the IRS 990 filings. And it's roughly 2/3 of all nonprofits hit that number, right? So it's a safe metric. You can get less than, let's say you're at 60, you're just not going to get the full 10 points for the metric. You'll get less points. We do take points away for less than 70. What we don't do, and I mentioned this before we started speaking, was this idea of what's too much, right? And one of the areas that I've wanted to investigate is, let's say between 70 and 90 is a good threshold, but more than 90 means you're starving your organization. Right? We're not doing that today. We're not sort of penalizing and taking points away for too much. We could. The thing that we are looking at, which is signs of organizational spend that are looking at leadership capacity development, right? And what are you spending on that? We do, and we have always looked at working capital, right? Which is essentially, what are your reserves? And the current metric is looking for 6 months of reserves. And I think COVID was probably the first real wake-up call that that's a really good metric, right? Because many organizations had to do a lot of rethinking on how they were going to make money because certain fundraising practices were no longer possible without in-person events. And so if you didn't have reserves, chances are you're not here anymore, right? And so I think that was a hard lesson. We're facing that a little bit in today's world where there have been cutbacks. And I think it's a different challenge now because it's a different set of circumstances and it's being applied unilaterally to certain areas, and that's harder.
Yeah. And not only the cuts, but everything that's going with them, the anti-nonprofit propaganda and the clawback of money that was already given. So sort of breaking the trust that we all had in their government. and so much else. So yeah, it's true. And so many foundations in 2025 kept their powder dry to see what was going to happen. So that had ripple effects for other grantees and things like that weren't necessarily facing federal cuts. So I'm glad to hear you commit to at least investigating if overhead could be presented as information on the site, on a profile, but not part of the actual formula. That's an incredible opportunity and step. It sounds like you've demand from your users to get the information about overhead and CEO salary. And it's such a important play between supply and demand. You know, if for 11 years, Charity Navigator was using that as the absolute measure in some ways, and it's not just Charity Navigator, the IRS, the auditors, the whole system is set up with that simple metric being available and being emphasized. So we have to educate nonprofits. And that's why the letters that you all sent out along with BBBY's Giving Alliance and GuideStar, now Candid, were so important, I think. And they're not on the websites anymore. As far as I've been able to find, they're not really on the internet unless somebody captured them. And so I save them as PDFs and I send them to people once in a while. And I'm going to put them up with the show notes for this episode. But would you get those two letters back up on your site and see if BBB and Candid would get them back up? And like, what else can you do personally and in your role to educate donors as well as nonprofits about this myth and how to use overhead as a ratio appropriately and not as a proxy for everything?
It's a great question. And I didn't realize for some reason, and this, again, those letters were before my time at Charity Navigator.
Right.
And they used to live on GuideStar. For some reason, GuideStar became the custodian of the letters, at least when I began.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that when GuideStar and the Foundation Center merged and became Candid, they were not seen as sort of pivotal and didn't make the cut. In each of the organizations, you have new leadership. We have new leadership at Candid. You have new leadership at BBBY's Giving Alliance. And I guess I'm the old man now. You
can lead. You've got the institutional knowledge among the three.
Yep. We've done podcasts on this. We did, I know Ann May and Art Taylor when he was still at BB. We did an overhead discussion. I used to do overhead discussions with Jacob Harold. Mm-hmm. Often done them with Art Taylor. So I think it's as though, it's funny, it does need a refresh and it needs a new face on some levels. But we've got to figure, it's worth doing because I'll be honest with you, when I get to speak to mainstream media a lot, and sadly that is also one of the questions I get. What brings me on the media calls or interviews is how to not get ripped off by the charitable sector and how to know where's the money going, right? And so I've built a whole rhetoric of bridging techniques to move from the overhead discussion to show, well, it's actually not overhead, it's impact. And you got to look for signs of impact. And here's the things that we're measuring. And as a donor, you really need to be asking for impact. The challenge that I would put out to the nonprofits is you've got to tell us your impact story. Tell it through ratings, tell it through stories, show us what you're accomplishing. We're really good at defining the problem. Mm-hmm. We often end up giving the donor the overhead ratio because that's what they're asking. But you've got to show the impact so that we have something better to talk about than your financial ratios. I mean, it's that simple.
That's it. Well, that's a good way to end it. Michael Thatcher from Charity Navigator, thank you so much. And for folks, just to reiterate here, how can they tell them the website again? Sure. And are there newsletters? Are there social media presence that you all have where people can find Charity Navigator?
Sure. So the website is www.charitynavigator.org. And we're on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, where you'll find us either as Charity Nav or Charity Navigator. You also see a lot on LinkedIn. Give us your data for nonprofits. It's charitynavigator.org/portal. And that'll put you right into a login screen where you can claim your brand assets. If you're a 4-star charity, take those, use them. And then also you can submit more data so that we're looking at you in a more holistic way. And that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rusty. This is great.
Thanks for listening to the Fund the People podcast. Visit fundthepeople.org and click on podcast to find the show notes and resources from this and other episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd really appreciate a 5-star rating and a quick review or comment in your podcast app of choice. It helps more people to find the show. To get the extended version of this interview, plus lots of bonus content, I invite you to join our Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/fundthepeople to subscribe today. Thank you for the work you do. Remember to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another.